Yep.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Dr. Waller. I would
Good.
like everyone to help me join in and welcome Dr. Benjamin Smith, who is joining us from the Department of History at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Professor Smith is a historian of modern Mexican history at Warwick University in the UK, who also taught at Michigan State between 2004 and 2013. Dr. Smith has done most of his research in the archives, villages, churches, and markets of the predominantly indigenous state of Oaxaca. The author of several books on politics and religion in Mexican history, Dr. Smith has just published The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade, a myth-busting 100-year history of the Mexican drug trade. Dr. Smith draws on unprecedented archival research, leaked DEA, Mexican law enforcement, and cartel documents, and dozens of harrowing interviews to tell the real story of how and why this once peaceful industry turned violent. The Financial Times described The Dope as a magisterial and immensely readable, the true crime at its historical best, replete with all the larger-than-life characters and thrills and spills of a Netflixnarco drama. The New York Times, a couple of weeks ago, praised The Dope as chilling and prodigious, and for its author's combination of journalist's eye and historian's perspective. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Hello, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much the Town and Gown group, and thank you, John, for inviting me to this. I'd just like to correct you on I wish I was in Warwick History Department. Currently, we have no building, so I'm in a shed in my garden, which is slightly less romantic. But anyway, maybe I should maintain that illusion. Anyway, so I'm here to talk about my book that's just come out called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. Which is basically, as you've heard, a kind of 100-year history of the drug trade in Mexico from about kind of 1910 through to the present day. And I really wanted to kind of deal with three subjects in this talk that will last around 35 minutes or so. First, why I wrote this book. Second, how I wrote it. And third, and for most of the talk, what I found. So first off, why did I write this book? So over the last few months, I've done quite a lot of kind of press and radio interviews on the book. And what people usually start with is, why did I start researching something quite so kind of bleak and miserable? Well, I should say at the outset, it was not my intention. When I arrived in Mexico 2 decades ago, I didn't come for the drugs or the violence or even the booze, although as a Brit, I had a kind of sneaking regard for Graham Greene's Whiskey Priest. Like many naive 20-somethings then, I came to Mexico for the politics. And the early 2000s were a bit of a dead zone for wannabe radicals. And to a bored London journalist like myself, Mexico seemed the place to be. It had a revolutionary history, relatively untarnished by famines or pogroms. It had a national palace plastered with comic strip murals of dashing heroes. It even had some actual real-life guerrillas in the form of the balaclava-clad Zapatistas. And when I arrived, they were on tour. It had legions of social movements, still not cynical about democracy. If I came for the politics then, I stayed for the people, and I lived in southern Mexico and worked in as an English teacher for over a year, and I fell in love with the country, its communities. I fell in love with the people's warmth, their kindness, their friendship, their wisdom, and also their bleak sense of humour. And when I returned after a year to Cambridge to pursue a PhD in 16th century English history, I immediately gave it up and switched to studying Mexico. Over the last decade or so, I threw myself into researching and writing about the 19th and 20th century in Mexico, from indigenous lawmakers to market women, to militant religious movements, to anti-communist rebels, Catholic scientists, and most recently, Mexican journalists. I was also at the same time lucky to marry into a vast Mexican family full of terrifying, thundering aunts and quiet, shuffling, good-humoured uncles. Like so much of Mexico, this family is spread everywhere, from China to Italy to Brazil to Mexico City, Tijuana, Oaxaca, and Los Angeles. They're artists, they're engineers, they sell tacos, they work for NASA, Together they can cover, I tried to work this out at supper time, 3 indigenous dialects, Oaxaca Spanish, Chilango slang, English, both UK and US variants, Spanglish, Portuguese, and Mandarin. Christmas is complete chaos. They're a Mexican success story and one that represents many of the positive changes that have occurred in Mexico over the past half century. But this family, I have to come to admit, is not entirely representative. And in the last 7 or 8 years, 2 forces have pushed me to leave the past behind and try to write about the Mexico I can see rather than the one I want to imagine. So the first reason then is just basically intellectual. The dope's an attempt to understand things that I, and I think a lot of other historians, have ignored or at least underestimated. That is the power of the illicit economy, the power of the police force, and a war that has been going on for longer than most of our lifetimes. The dope is also a bid to contextualize these things, not in the kind of bleak imagery of true crime, but in the Mexico I fell in love with, and which still exists not only in the inspiring cries of civil society, but also in the people themselves, the Mexicans who are not involved in drug crime that make up most of the country. The second reason that I got involved in researching this is a bit more personal. Over the past 2 decades, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Mexicans have fled Mexico for the United States. They've fled everything from land grabs and family feuds, through extortion and kidnapping, to human trafficking and illegal mining. Around 2012, a small handful of lawyers started to approach me asking for help assessing the risk that these Mexican refugees faced. And over the next 5 years or so, I sat down, occasionally in person, more often on the end of a telephone line, to talk to these refugees. And I listened to their stories and I helped them put together their petitions for asylum. But the stories pushed me in another way, to attempt to understand both the roots of Mexico's contemporary violence, but also how the Mexico I'd lived in and fallen in love with had descended into the Mexico that was forcing so many Mexicans to flee. If it was these 2 reasons then that pushed me to write the book, my next hurdle was how to write it. Now, as you might expect, researching an illegal industry is a pretty tough job. On the one hand, drug trafficking is enveloped in myths. These myths tell a pretty simple story of a war between North and South, between white and brown, between noble and well-intentioned cops, and a threatening cabal of vicious kingpins, corrupt Mexican politicians, and shadowy, powerful cartels. Such myths may contain granules of truth, but in essence, they are myths. They are propaganda. They obscure rather than clarify. They also serve a clear political purpose. They demonize the drug traffickers and they cement a narrative of the drug war as a simple war between good and evil. They legitimize official violence. Drug cops carry guns because they must fight well-armed traffickers. They shoot, but only when shot at. If the drug trade then is shrouded in myth, it is also shrouded in secrecy. In fact, just tracing the very identities of traffickers is difficult enough. Many of them have dozens of different aliases, and they shift between different aliases depending on their context. So, for example, I spent about 2 years tracking down a man who was known by pretty much every West Coast weed smuggler of the late 60s, early 70s as Papa Grande. He was a legendary drug trafficker that trafficked only in the finest form of pot, something called sin semilla. As I say, he was a legend. He was even commemorated in songs by the Eagles. However, no one knew his name. So I had to triangulate various hippie versions of who this guy was with contacts on the Mexican side who led me up in the mountains to try and track down who this guy actually was. And I think I eventually managed to track down and confirm that he was a man called Roberto Beltran, who came from the south of the state of Sinaloa. and had himself an extraordinary backstory in Mexico itself. He was a kind of 1960s version of Chapo Guzman. So as I say, it's not only shrouded in myths, it's also shrouded in secrecy. Now, unpacking these myths and pulling aside the veil of secrecy and discovering the real story of Mexico's drug trade was not easy. Stereotypes, particularly, are firmly entrenched. They configure the way the documents are written, they structure the way we read them, and they shape the way we've told these stories in the past. But researching the drug trade, I found, was possible. For a start, declassification programs have started to open up political, judicial, and private archives on both sides of the border. And on the back of a substantial grant from the British government, over the past 8 years or so, I visited somewhere around 50 of these collections, from big air-conditioned national archives to dusty scorpion-infested cells. I also combined these orthodox archives with a plethora of classified US and Mexican documents. Some of these came from Freedom of Information Acts applications, but others came from private collections. And many journalists and not a few DEA agents and some drug traffickers lent me some of their documents and some of their private collections. They included a photo album of a major Sinaloa kingpin, classified DEA and customs documents from half a dozen officers, and the sole known photograph of the legendary trafficker and El Chapo's mentor, Pedro Aviles, on a mortuary slab with half his head missing. As well as all this kind of documentary evidence that I was compiling, I also did interviews, somewhere in the region of kind of 50 or so interviews with those involved in the drug trade and those involved in policing the drug trade. Many were DEA officers who were down in Mexico during the 70s and 80s, and they led me into this murky world of overseas US drug policy, the characters, the clashes, and the rather gung-ho attitude to lives and laws. At the same time, I also tracked down a bunch of US drug traffickers, particularly weed traffickers, many of whom had gone to prison in the 60s and 70s, had come out of jail in the 80s and 90s, and were now operating legally on the West Coast. Many of their children were actually running legal weed farms. Finally, I also talked to a lot of, or a fair few, drug growers from up in the mountains of Sinaloa and Oaxaca and Guerrero on the west coast of Mexico. The last thing then I want to say about how I wrote this book is about the writing itself. It seems to me, and I know John and I have talked about this a lot, but a lot of academic literature, from history to sociology to political science, is written in what I kind of class as a kind of high Baroque style, and it's kind of impenetrable to the uninitiated. I think we often spend our PhD and most of about the first decade of our careers attempting to very consciously ape this form of language. Even most pop history is written in what I think in England we'd probably term Oxbridge English, but in the US you might term Ivy League or New Yorker style, all thesaurus adjectives and forced metaphors. I remember recently reading These Truths by Jill Lepore and finding it like swimming through kind of an oil slick of verbiage. The stylistic tics seem to be kind of highlighted in neon. So anyway, for the dope, I instead kind of went completely the opposite way. I read a lot of James Elroy, I read a lot of Dashiell Hammett, I read a lot of Raymond Chandler, and I attempted to kind of strip away all the extraneous stuff and tell the story of the Mexican drug trade using techniques drawn from detective fiction. So short vignettes, deliberately staccato beat, action sequences interspersed with background description, and a kind of tone of world-weary cynicism. I tried, and I realize now, reading this back, it looks enormously pretentious, but to write a kind of noir version of history. So anyway, that's enough about the rather self-conscious job of how and why I wrote this book. What about the stuff I'm slightly more comfortable with, which is what I found, right? So if you read the book, you can see it deals with about 100 years of Mexican drug smuggling and the efforts against it. And you can read about this, I hope, relatively interesting characters, including a cross-dressing border smuggler, Enrique Fernandez, who pioneered the Ciudad Juarez trade in the 1920s. You can read about the mysterious Roberto Beltran, aka Papa Grande, who was the kind of counterculture hippies go-to marijuana vendor. And you can read about Arturo Durazo, the Mexican police chief who built an entire mock version of the Parthenon with the proceeds from the cocaine trade. But I hope at least that there's more to this book than just entertaining stories, and that readers come away with essentially 4 main points that I want to go into now. I'm not going to deal with them at great length, maybe kind of 5 minutes each. So my first point in this book is easily the most obvious. And it is that the driving force of the drug trade is and always has been economic. America has an enduring and enormous appetite for narcotics. In the late 19th century, according to some estimates, 2 to 4% of the US population was addicted to morphine. A century later, America was consuming 70% of the world's cocaine. The American hunger for intoxication then has dwarfed that of Mexico. In the 70s, for example, the CIA made the very conservative estimate that there were about 450,000 heroin addicts in the United States. Most people thought there were about 600,000 heroin addicts in the United States. I'm guessing the CIA played this down, given it was actually producing some of the heroin. Anyway, in comparison, they did also try to find out how many heroin addicts there were in Mexico. And they interviewed about 20,000 people, and they couldn't find a single heroin addict in all of Mexico. They couldn't even find somebody who'd even tried opiates. This was despite the fact that at the time, Mexico was producing 95% of America's heroin. So the ceaseless US demand then for drugs has merged with the persistent poverty of the average Mexican. Even during the middle decades of the 20th century, when Mexico, frankly, was doing relatively well, average wages were rarely 10% of those in the United States. In the 1980s, average wages in Mexico were only 6% of those in the United States. In very basic terms, you could earn the average annual Mexican wage by working for 2 weeks in the United States. This combination then of high drug demand and low wages has generated these kind of enormous incentives to produce and traffic drugs. Now, there's no established way to assess these incentives, so I kind of came up with my own. It's an estimate of the quantities of various drugs a Mexican has to sell in the US to earn the annual Mexican wage. Well, the result's pretty telling. Over the last 50 years, most Mexicans have had to earn an average wage. A Mexican would have to sell an average of 700 grams of marijuana, 18 grams of heroin, or 60 grams of cocaine on the US streets. Now, that's basically marijuana weighing 2 cans of soup, coke weighing a tennis ball, or smack weighing just 3 US quarters. And this is only the average. During the 1980s and 1990s, you could earn the average wage by growing a single marijuana plant or a window box of poppies as driving a cab for an entire year. So, as I said, the major, or one of the major points, is economic. Basically, the US has a major demand for narcotics. Mexico has very poor wages and, as a result, a massive incentive to grow them, produce them, transport them. The second point I make is perhaps a little bit more surprising and one that I kind of discuss quite a lot. It concerns the relationship between the drug trade and the authorities. Now, since governments prohibited drug trafficking in the 1910s, many Mexican politicians have sought to harness the income from the illegal trade. As long as drugs went north, the trade caused limited social or political fallout, and no one blamed the politicians. Frankly, who cared? In general, these politicians have taken a cut. by instituting what we might call protection rackets over the drug trade. That means they have charged certain favored drug traffickers a fee or a percentage of the profits to protect their enterprises and not to apply the law. Those that have refused to pay the politicians have been arrested or sometimes murdered. Now, for over a century, observers have deemed this system corruption. But I think corruption is a bit of an imprecise and a not terribly helpful term. Such a blanket expression obscures what has been actually a kind of subtle and rather shifting set of arrangements. So, for example, up until the 1970s, these protection rackets were controlled by local governments, and they were manned by the local police. Though many of these officials got very rich, there were limits to this corruption. Authorities sought to distribute at least some of the drug money, either through schools and road building, or by forcing the drug traffickers to do individual acts of philanthropy. And they sought to check violence in the trade. If they didn't check violence, they would risk US or Mexican federal intervention. During the 1970s, certain Mexican national institutions, particularly the federal police, took over these local protection rackets. Corruption then changed from a mechanism that kind of greased the wheels at the local level to what political scientists now term grand corruption. These new racketeers then no longer hailed from the region that they controlled. They had no longer links with the communities they extorted, so they stole more, they distributed less, and they became increasingly casual about the use of violence. Since 1990, this corruption has shifted once more. Increased drug profits and declining state power has kind of upended the state protection rackets. In many regions of Mexico, the traffickers still pay the authorities, but now the traffickers are in charge. They control the protection rackets. They decide the rules of the game. They have, in the words of some political scientists, basically performed state capture. They control now sways of the police that used to control them. So Mexican corruption then has attracted the headlines, although, as I say, it's a much more complicated than simply private percolation. And Mexican corruption has become firmly entrenched in the myths surrounding the drug trade. Watch any series or any film about the Mexican drug trade, and I guarantee the Mexican corrupt politician is there right at the center. Yet, as I discovered, corruption never stopped at the border. Stories of hard-nosed sheriffs and principal drug agents mask similar entrenched corruption on the US side. Just as in Mexico, the enormous profits from the drug trade were tough to resist, and they persuaded many agents from local law enforcement, customs, the DEA, and the CIA to either look the other way or to overtly protect the trade. So as I say, this is not discussed in systemic terms in the United States, but I believe it is as systemic as in Mexico. The third finding relates to counter-narcotics policies, that is, anti-drug policies. Now, drug myths suggest that punitive policies are logical responses to genuine threats. So policy hawks target kingpins or peddlers or cultivators of drugs because they say this is the most efficient way to stop Americans injecting or smoking or snorting drugs. But studying a century of south of the border anti-drugs efforts reveals that such policies are very rarely implemented for their effectiveness. Driven in moral panics, for bureaucratic fundraising, and also managerial scapegoating. They target whatever group is deemed easiest to cow, capture, or sell to the public as a victory. And they're supported by the relentless manipulation of facts and figures through administrative sleight of hand deliberate distortion of evidence, or straight out lying. There was not one DEA agent that didn't say most of my colleagues didn't simply take down a kilo of cocaine or find a kilo of cocaine. They would always add milk powder or some other white powder in order to expand its weight and make them look better. It's absolutely institutionalized in the way that the drug war is fought. Furthermore, these policies never actually fulfill their aims. Cutting supply never raises prices and lowers US addiction rates for more than a few months. American drug demand is simply too large. The incentives are simply too great. And patterns of drug taking are basically broadly independent of supply. In actual fact, Mexico did have allegedly 2 successful campaigns against drugs, one in the 40s and one in the 70s. But they were followed by a massive a tripling of US heroin addiction during the 1950s and a massive escalation in US cocaine addiction in the 1980s. It simply did not work. What unforgiving anti-drugs policies do cause, however, is increased violence. And this brings me to my 4th finding, which concerns the connection between the drug trade and the use of force. Now, most commentators argue that the narcotics business inevitably generates violence. It is, as one commentator said, it's in the DNA of the drug trade. They give many reasons for the inevitability of the violence. They say the stakes are high, the trade attracts criminals and sociopaths, and without official regulation, disputes are decided by force. Now, over the last 15 years in Mexico, this has not been a difficult argument to make. Yet it's important not to let contemporary horror obscure both the history of the trade and the origins of the violence. So, as I say, one of the principal causes of this violence has been the war on drugs itself. In Mexico, aggressive counter-narcotics policing was very slow to take off. US diplomatic bullying forced law changes in the late 40s, and by the early 1950s, there was a relatively forceful militarized eradication campaigns. But basically, during this period, the drug trade was completely pacific. Why? It was organized by families up in the highlands of Mexico that were linked by blood, by marriage, by friendship, and by neighborhood. They got on, and they were linked, and there were links of trust between them. In the early 1970s, however, Nixon's drug war transformed counter-narcotics policing south of the border. US drug agents, Mexican cops, and Mexican soldiers descended on areas of drug production and trafficking like an invading army. They arrested tens of thousands, they tortured thousands, and they killed hundreds. They racked up their own body count. There were similar rapid US-backed escalations of drug policing after the murder of the DEA agent Enrique Quique Camarena in 1985, and again with the election of Felipe Calderón to president in 2006. Yet beyond the direct victims of this drug policing, what I found was such uncompromising policing also had a crucial secondary effect. As the risks increased, drug traffickers turned on one another to avoid the threat of capture or worse. The cooperation that marked the first half of the century of the trade decreased, and by the 1990s evaporated almost completely. Traffickers gave evidence on each other to escape long sentences, to avoid torture, or to save their families. And traffickers killed anyone suspected of being a police informer and sending them to jail. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Now we are moving to our question and answer portion of this event. If you have a question and you don't want to read it aloud, you can put it in the chat and I will read it for you. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Dr. Smith by your own, you can raise your hand and I will call on you.
Chris, can I jump in?
Yes, of course, Dr. Waller.
Ben, that was fantastic. Thank you. It's a lot to absorb. Can I just ask? I follow the complete argument that virtually every intervention has been counterproductive, and yet it's easy to understand why the interventions took place. Is there a scenario in which the outcome of the heavy-handed policing of the 70s, 80s, and onwards could have been anticipated? Were those second-order effects that you described, were they obvious to people at the time and on the ground who were cautioning against coming down too hard on these old family traffickers?
That's a really good question. In all honesty, no. I mean, people continually ask me this. I say, well, why has America or why has Mexico repeated the same kind of failed tactics again and again? And I think we're in a way, you're assuming that people in authority, either in Mexico or the US, have the same aims as you or I. That is maybe to bring down overdoses or bring down the amount of drugs going into the United States or bring down the violence. I think their aims are to increase, is to basically, on a macro level, to increase the budget of whatever part of the bureaucracy they work for. Secondly, to make sure that they don't get in trouble for some potential, mistake that they've made. They don't get blamed for it. And thirdly, on an individual basis, to get to kind of rise up the hierarchy of this bureaucracy. So I'm enormously cynical about their actual aims. Their aims don't, if their aims are to bring, the classic example is, it's really depressing, right? But over the last 15 years, 200,000 Mexicans have died in drug-related violence. 100,000 have gone missing. Just last year, 100,000 Americans died of mostly fentanyl and heroin overdoses. Now, in the book, I'm fairly shocked. In 1978, the Americans are clutching their pearls because 1,500 heroin addicts die of overdoses. It's 100,000 last year. So it's simply. I think they're very, very well aware that this doesn't work. But I don't think they care. Well, having said that, many DEA agents I met were either alcoholic messes who really didn't. Felt enormously guilty about their role in this, or couldn't really make sense of it. They realized that it hadn't worked. Some of them often would kind of drink with them afterwards, and they would say, all I did is put some small fry in prison. None of the real people got caught. A lot of them thought that there was just as much corruption up the kind of US hierarchy as there was in Mexico. So yeah, they realized this kind of after the event. At the time, you're just kind of pulled along by the institution, by the kind of institutional culture of the place, I think.
Thank you. The next question comes from Bud Schulman, and his question is, how does, in your opinion, the drug trade relate to the current border crisis in the United States?
It's a really good question. The aspect of Haiti, the Haitians who were there, we had some absolutely dreadful and quite disturbing pictures. It's not particularly connected, but one of the reasons that none of these people the Central Americans don't want to stay in northern Mexico, and the Mexicans who are fleeing from southern Mexico don't want to stay in the cities of northern Mexico, which they're being asked to do, is basically because organized crime groups have moved on from simply trafficking drugs and towards loads of other forms of crime. One of the most profitable of which is kidnapping and extorting migrants. So there've been some horrific, this is what we're seeing at the moment. It's kind of the edge of there have been worse things in the past. So it was, I think it was while I was in Michigan. So it's in 2011. They found, 74 Central American and South American migrants just all shot in the head about 50 miles from the US-Mexican border. So, that's the connection. The other connection, I suppose, is that why are all these people turning up? Well, basically because, again, organized crime groups have shifted from simply trafficking drugs and producing drugs towards other forms of organized crime, and particularly extorting, kidnapping, taking land. There's been enormous displacement of people. I mean, they think that somewhere in the region of 40,000 Mexicans have been displaced from this state called Guerrero in southern Mexico, where people have just taken over mining land that they think might have mining potential and also might be able to grow avocados on it. So this is, I mean, this goes way, way beyond the drug trade in many ways. It's a really good question, though. It's something I've kind of been thinking a lot about.
Thank you. The next question comes from Joel and Kathy Hoffman, and their question is, it's fairly obvious that the war on drugs is a waste of resources in the United States. What ideas do you have that might change this situation, such as legalize or decriminalize drugs in the United States for the economy of Mexico?
It's again a really good question, one that I kind of eternally ponder, and then irritated reviews on Goodreads go, has no solutions, 3-star. But I mean, I'm now going to offer you my kind of solution. I think for a start, I think we certainly in the UK, which has pretty harsh drug laws as well, very harsh drug laws, and the US, we think that the road to decriminalization or legalization is kind of miles away. It's so distant, we can't kind of quantify. We can think, okay, maybe by the end of our lifetimes, weed might be legal, but can we really see they're going to decriminalize kind of coke and heroin? However, like Portugal have effectively done it. Other countries have done it, and it's worked, right? Portugal decriminalized heroin, and also putting a lot of money into helping people recover from heroin addiction and get off heroin. It was enormously successful. It took down HIV rates, which were really, really high, and it took down the rate of heroin addiction in the country. So I mean, the model is there for us. I think it's pretty obvious. So I think that decriminalization and legalization or in a way, they're not enough. The fundamental reason why 100,000 people are dying is not something kind of innate in Americans. Rather, it is to do with the lack of medical care, which means that a lot of people are in pain, and as a result of taking narcotics, and the lack of psychological care, which means a lot of people are in distress, and as a result of their taking narcotics. So that kind of has to be sorted out as well at the kind of base level in the United States. And if both those were kind of sorted out, then Mexico wouldn't have a market, you know, of drugs really to sell, right? So I think that would probably be helpful in terms of improving the Mexican economy. And this is something that the current president is attempting to do, but he's been really undercut, basically because the Mexican economy kind of crashed in 2018 and then COVID happened. I mean, this is part of his plan. And he's also attempting not to directly confront drug cartels, which I think is a relatively sensible attitude, although he's continually being cajoled to do this by the DEA. Just last week, the head of the Mexican Foreign Service, Mexican State Department, basically, went to meet the head of the DEA in Washington. It wasn't reported on in the US, as far as I can make out. It was reported on in Mexico. If you can read Spanish, there's a very good column by a guy called Carlos Perez Ricart today, and he explains the DEA were absolutely up in arms. They're furious that the current government is not going after kingpins, and as a result, I think they're playing a really cynical game, because the Mexicans want to extradite a couple of super corrupt, kind of high-profile politicians from the US, from Miami, where they have houses, and the Americans are refusing to do it until the Mexicans go after the kingpins. So this is a kind of game of, it's neither country wins, right? It's kind of mired in that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Other questions for Dr. Smith? Esther.
Ben, I'm curious about what you think about here in Michigan. We now have virtually, I mean, in reality, not virtual, we have pot shops. We have recreational marijuana, and it's all very respectable. And I think the little stores are doing quite well. And we do not hear about disruptive behavior by people who frequent these places. Do you see the U.S. expanding this recreational, not just legalization, but recreational use of marijuana as being helpful? I mean,
I think it's helpful for the United States. I mean, I really think that keeping low-level weed dealers and low-level weed addicts out of prison is really, really helpful. I mean, I was there during the first wave of. Do you remember when they had kind of medical marijuana in Michigan?
Sure. Oh yeah.
So I was there for that, and I do remember that for about 6 months, all my students, there was a kind of misty fog of weed that hung over my students as they wandered into class. But then eventually they kind of frankly got bored of it and kind of pulled themselves together in the end.
Right.
But you know, there was a kind of excitement of the novel or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really good for the United States. I don't think it's helping in Mexico at all. In actual fact, I think it's weirdly counterproductive. I mean, this is one of the I think it's the two things that we perhaps discount. One is we assume that because we see a lot of, you know, we probably all have grandkids, or we you know, or I have students who have smoked marijuana, right? So we assume that it's the thing that brings in loads of money, but in actual fact, it's a drop in the ocean, really, in the drug trade. I mean, they think even when, you know, pre-legalization in the US, it was 10, maybe 20% of their profits. I mean, not a huge amount. The second thing to bear in mind is, okay, you're absolutely right. Legalizations mean that there is basically the bottom fell out of the marijuana market in Mexico. No one grew weed, right? So what did they do? One, they moved into growing heroin. So if you want to know why 70,000 people died in 2017, it was basically because Mexicans were moved into growing opium poppies. The bottom has then fallen out of that, and now they basically import fentanyl from Asia.
But I hear that fentanyl is very easy to make, and that a lot of it is made here, a lot.
I think this is an enormous matter of debate. There are three ways that they think fentanyl enters the country. One is through Mexico, one is it's made in the US, and the third is it's made in Asia and then shipped in small FedEx packages. And I really don't think the DEA or customs have a clue, really. I mean, you can go to Mexico, and friends of mine have been to fentanyl labs there. They're clearly producing it there. They're getting a lot of the blame for it from the DEA, but to what extent that is the DEA trying to flex its muscles, trying to blame someone else, who knows? So you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the thing. A lot of this is just one thing you really realize when you kind of bury down into the data of all of this, is you realize that every department in America and every department in Mexico is just making up these statistics, making up these, you know, and then pushing them out to their various kind of chosen journalists who are expanding these stories really for their own benefit. So I'm sure you've read one that goes like, America, the center of fentanyl. Well, you know, and I've read ones that said, you know, Mexican West Coast, the center of fentanyl. But who knows?
Last week, they've quoted, I don't know how many thousands of fentanyl deaths there have been just in the past week.
Yep. It's incredibly, distressing. I mean, it was really, I mean, I'll tell you this just apropos of that, but in about 2018, 2019, I was kind of up in Oaxaca. It must have been 2018 then. I was in Oaxaca, and then some friends were in Sinaloa, and another one was Guerrero. We all kind of got in touch with each other, and we were saying, you know, do you know what's happening out in the hills? And all the peasants, all their friends, and some friends of mine were going that no one's buying heroin anymore. No one's touching heroin. Like, everyone's refusing to buy it. I think the price fell by about 80% in about 6 months, and the reason was fentanyl. They were just no one was bothering to buy it. So and you could see them, you know, the market it's extraordinarily quick, right? I kind of assumed that a market change of an addict in Philly would affect a kind of peasant down in a, rural nowheresville in Guerrero. I thought that would take kind of a long time, but it gets kind of got down in about 3 months. Don't grow heroin anymore. Don't grow opium anymore. But the really depressing factor is that, so not only did everyone choose from marijuana to growing opium, they also moved from growing marijuana to illegal logging, illegal mining, human trafficking, sex trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and loads of really horrible stuff. So yeah, it was pretty, didn't have a great effect. Anyway, sorry.
We have another question from Bud, and his question is that he has heard that the CIA is in the drug trade to finance off-the-book operations. Does that make the drug lords partners with the CIA?
That's a really good question. So I looked at, this is a tale that has been told by a couple of former CIA people, quite a lot of former DEA agents, a couple of less kind of cogent Mexican police officers. I think it's pretty clear. I think it's absolutely valid, 100% true that the CIA was well aware, for example, of the nationalist Chinese funding their operations against communist China with heroin. They were aware of the same thing happens in Laos during the Vietnam War, right? They were aware that the French were doing this. They were aware, no doubt, that the Nicaraguans were trafficking, the Nicaraguan Contras, who were the right wing that Reagan supported, were trafficking coke into LA, and they realized that this was allowing the crack epidemic to take off. They definitely knew about that. We know they knew about that. You can go online, you can see Oliver North writing in his diary, contraplane coming in, it has been used for drugs. He claims that he then told the DEA this. The DEA denies that he said this. It's a bit of a he said, she said scenario. So there is no doubt. What I found it quite difficult to get at was what part the CIA played in the Mexican drug trade. I think that's much, much more blurry. There's a documentary that you can go to on Amazon Prime called The Last Narc, which deals with a DEA agent who I met. He's a very good, he's an interesting guy. His claim is that the CIA was up to its neck in the big coke industry in Mexico in the 1980s, and even had a DEA agent killed to cover up its involvement. I think it's completely plausible, but I tried to track down. So, for example, they were claiming the CIA ran training camps for the Contras in East Mexico, using drug money and using drug traffickers, basically, houses and farms to run these camps in. Now, I went to look for these camps. I couldn't find them. I went to go and talk to people. I was saying, do you remember any kind of military encampments here? No one, no. Maybe didn't say if they did, but there were kind of holes in these stories that don't, it's the CIA. There were conspiracies within conspiracies and stuff like that. But I think it's completely plausible.
Thank you. This next question comes from Denise Carr, and her question is that it sounds as though the cartels have moved beyond drugs, and removing the market for drugs by legalizing drugs here may not affect the level of violence, or at least not soon. What else can be done?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question, because I think things have spiraled out of control. So now, we call them cartels, and we read about in the newspapers, and they're called cartels, but they're not cartels in any meaningful sense. They're not trying to control the price of drugs. Half of them might even there's one cartel. They call it the cartel, Santa Rosa de Lima, which is named after basically a saint in a state called, this very peaceful state called Guanajuato. Now, they're not involved in drugs. Their principal aim is basically stealing petrol And they're in a big fight with another cartel that also wants to steal all the petrol from these big refineries in central Mexico. So you're absolutely right. So how do you bring down violence given that it's not to do with narcotics? So the current president has aimed to offer economic and social opportunities to young men, because it's young men who produce the vast majority of this violence, which I think is a move in the right direction. One of the fundamental problems is that there isn't there is not a trustworthy police force in Mexico, and they have. I've been trying to work out quite how many, police forces they've got rid of in the last 2 decades, and I think it's somewhere in the region of 650 local, state, and federal police forces. They've completely got rid of for corruption. Nowadays, the vast majority of policing is done by the military. But I can tell you the other thing is, if history has taught us anything, it's when you get the military policing, murders go through the roof. It's really, really bad for security. So I haven't offered any hope there, really. I mean, okay, how has this got sorted out? Okay, that's a good question. It has been sorted out at the local level by civil society, that is individuals, no kind of political authority or anything, taking up arms and effectively instituting semi-anarchic local communities. I started this talk with talking about the Zapatistas. Everyone's gone Zapatista. I mean, so if you go down to kind of rural bits of Mexico now, there are indigenous villages which are almost completely cut off, and they won't let you in. There'll be armed people outside, but they are peaceful. They've got very low levels of homicide. But that's not very good for a functioning state.
Thank you. Other questions for Dr. Smith? Judith.
Is my mic on? Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to tell you about an experience that I had. And being a mom of mature boys now, I was very aware of their experimentation with marijuana during their teenage years. But now I have grandchildren that age, and I was very curious to see what happened when we legalized marijuana in the state of Michigan. So the experience I wanted to kind of bring up and just describe to you was so surprising to me as an anthropologist looking at things like that. So we go out to my son's ranch, and he's got a great big fire pit, okay? So along comes my grandson's friends, and they're in their mid-20s, and they're smoking pot all around the fire circle. They've got jars in which they have little humidistats in the jar with all their buds in there. My grandson is growing it in a little thing down in his basement that's lit and all, and they're talking about the benefits of that and oil and all those other things at a very scientific level. And it really encourages them to have a group of friends that are likewise. These are not dope fiends, and I don't know whether any of that will spread to other drugs, but I think socially it's fascinating. These are bright, engaged people.
I mean, I've had similar kind of experiences. I mean, I can't really smoke. I just kind of go white and pass out. I mean, I'm really have a particular poor reaction to it. So I always find it quite embarrassing when I turn up with these kind of California, old hippies with their weed growing sons who are often very like the people that you describe.
I can't tolerate it either.
Yeah. So I'm always and they're always going to pass me a massive joint. I'm just I'm fine. But having said all that, and my yeah, I mean, lots of people do. Yeah, it is taken extremely seriously. The one thing I will say is that it's also, I think, radically stronger than it ever was. I think in the 60s and 70s, and that's what.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
And you know, still the issue of the link between marijuana smoking and schizophrenia is not. That seems to be a massive debate still. Whether it is simply smoked by people who have untested schizophrenia and as a result they are self-medicating, or is it actually causing schizophrenia? And that seems to be,
that's a problem.
Up in the air. So I'm not here to kind of preach legalization or anything like that.
Culturally, that it's very interesting to see how social groups change in this environment.
Yeah. I completely agree. I mean, whether that can happen. I mean, so there is an interesting Harvard. I mean, you probably know this guy, John. This Harvard, is he a biochemist? This guy Carl Hart. Have you come across him? So he's kind of, it was a bit of a kind of media sensation. Have you come across him, John?
I haven't. No.
So he wrote a kind of, I can't remember, like a grown-up guide to drug use or something like that. It came out last year. It made a kind of big hit. I mean, partly because he's an African-American Harvard biochemist who also is a relatively big leisure drug user, and not just marijuana, but also I think heroin and cocaine. And he's quite open about this, but also thinks that a lot of the studies of addiction massively overplay quite how prevalent addiction is among drug users, and also underplay how much it is linked to childhood trauma and other forms of kind of psychological distress. So I mean, I thought that was quite interesting. As I say, I'm not a scientist, but I thought it was quite a kind of, it's quite a powerful, at least provocative argument. So maybe you're right. Maybe, I mean, you know, again, I think we think the vision that is given us by the kind of drug police is that as soon as you opened up morphine or heroin and sold it out of a pharmacy, everyone would be there, you know, jacking it up. But I mean, you know, the fact of the matter is it would be used like it should be as a kind of pain relief medicine, and various kind of, you know, forms it kind of like it was in the 19th century. Yeah. And then treatment would be given to you like it was for, you know, Eugene O'Neill's mum was a morphine addict, right? And treatment was given to her. I mean, it was not a pleasant mother maybe to have, but they did treat her in the end.
Thank you. Other questions for Dr. Smith?
Can I jump in with another?
Of course.
If you're thinking about escapist narcotics, which cause different levels of psychological change, booze of various kinds, cigarettes, marijuana, objectively, you would have thought that marijuana is the hardest to demonize. And yet that is the one that they managed to associate with, what was the term, reefer madness, much of the early 20th century. Why was it that marijuana, which is now becoming, as Judy was saying, so routine, was so much easier to stigmatize than booze and cigarettes?
Because no one smoked. It was almost unknown in the United States in 1936. It was a completely weird law. So it's effectively, again, it's bureaucratic muscle flexing by Anslinger. So post-prohibition going out, he's kind of stuffed, right? Heroin addiction is going down, not because he's done anything, basically because heroin addiction, it goes through kind of weird generational changes. People don't, basically the sons and daughters of heroin addicts don't tend to get addicted to heroin because they've seen the damage that is done to their parents. The grandkids of heroin addicts are the ones, so it kind of passes a generation. So anyway, 1930s, heroin addiction's going down. Cocaine is basically dead. There is no cocaine there's a kind of global shortage of cocaine, basically because they stopped Peru producing coca. and Japan's kind of cut off, which is the other major producer. So he's got nothing to do. He knows that marijuana. He two things. One, he knows that marijuana isn't addictive. It's got no problems. I mean, if you look at his letters, he's really well aware of this. And the second thing is, he doesn't want to police it. As soon as the Marijuana Tax Act is passed, he's like, yeah, we don't want anything to do with this. It's a massive pain in the arse. And it's basically unpoliceable because marijuana grows everywhere, not only in Mexico, but also in the US, right? And grows in, because it's hemp, right? So this is completely unpoliceable. So I mean, it emerged out of, bureaucratic muscle flexing. What's fascinating, and I think what happens is, this is my own kind of personal theory, is that then it becomes kind of it becomes a big kind of press issue in the late 1930s. It's taken up by the kind of yellow press, particularly. And then what I find is quite interesting is that then teenagers growing up in the late 40s, early 50s take that demonization of marijuana and go, oh yeah, right, that's the rebellious thing to smoke. So in a way, Anslinger creates reefer madness, and it didn't even exist. Why are you, a teenager smoking weed in San Diego in 1955? Because that, bald Anslinger has been on TV saying it'll rot your mind. So yeah, I mean, all of these things are unbelievably counterproductive.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Smith? Okay. I think that is a good time to conclude this session. I want to thank Dr. Smith on behalf of the program for joining us tonight. If you have any final questions, we will be here lingering about for the next couple minutes. But thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks.
Thank you. Take care, guys. Cheers. Thank you very much.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.
Good program.
Thanks, Ben.
Cheers,
You can go to
mate.
bed now.
Bye. Yeah, thanks a lot. I will.
Hope that pub is still open.
He's gone.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Good night.
Good night.